On the chest of a fictional butcher in a fictional seaside town, there was a row of medal ribbons. To the millions who watched Dad's army, up to 18 million at its peak, they were just part of the costume. A bit of colour on the uniform of a doddery old soldier who could not stop talking about the Sudan. But the writers had been clever. Those ribbons told a story. They traced an entire invented life. A boy who joined up at 14, a drummer in a real regiment, Egypt, the charge at Omdurman, the northwest frontier of India, the trenches of the Great War. Lance Corporal Jack Jones had been given a soldier's whole career, stitched into the silk on his chest. It was all written for him, the campaigns, the wounds, the medals, the endless stories about General Kitchener and the Fuzzy Wuzzies, and here is the strange part. The man wearing those invented medals did not need them, because the actor playing Jack Jones had a war of his own. A real one. He had been bombed, starved, marched across a continent, and held behind wire for 4 years. He had stood face to face with a German rifle. He had dug a man out of a crater with his bare hands. His name was Clive Dunn, and his real war was darker, stranger, and braver than anything the writers of Dad's army ever dared to invent. This is the tragic truth behind Corporal Jones. He was not born Clive Dunn. He was born Robert Dunn on the 9th of January 1920 in Brixton, in the south of London. He came from a world of grease paint and footlights. Both his parents were entertainers. His father, Bobby, and his mother, Connie, made their living on the stage, touring camps and theatres and factory halls, wherever there was an audience to be found. The young Robert grew up backstage. Performing was not a dream he reached for, it was simply the family trade. He was sent away to school in Kent, and then trained at a well-known theatre academy in London. He was barely a teenager when the cameras found him. While he was still a schoolboy, he appeared in 2 comedy films alongside one of the biggest screen comedians of the day. A child already at home in front of a lens. By 1939, he was a young man working in the theatre, a stage manager on a touring play. He was 19 years old. He had a small flat, a Welsh collie puppy, and a future that looked like it would be spent making people laugh. And then, on the 3rd of September, 1939, the radio told the country it was at war. What happened next reads like a sketch he might have written himself. Clive wanted to serve. The trouble was, nobody seemed to want him. He went first to the Navy, who told him he would have to sign on for 8 years, perhaps 12, which seemed rather a lot, so he left. He tried the army next, but that day they were only taking cobblers and butchers, and he was neither, so a sergeant asked his age, heard 19, and sent him home to wait. He set off for the Air Force instead, where a stranger stopped him in the street to explain he would need a certain exam pass to fly, and Clive had failed his French by 5 marks, and that was the Air Force gone too. Defeated by his own country's recruiting offices, he went home. It was an advertisement on the wall of an underground train that finally gave him a war. The auxiliary ambulance service wanted volunteers. He signed up. He studied first aid and passed the exam with 98%. He could not wait to save his first life. His first call came one night when a raid was expected. The ambulances raced to their positions across the city. In the thrill of the moment, Clive leapt onto the back of his ambulance, missed his footing, fell off, and sprained his ankle. He became the very first casualty of his own unit. It is worth pausing on this, because this is the man, the one who would later play the most accident-prone soldier on British television. The difference is that the bumbling on screen was an act. The bumbling in 1939 was real, and it was about to be tested by something far less funny. In the spring of 1940, the call-up papers came at last. He reported to a training camp in Dorset, and the army set about turning the worst recruit in Britain into a soldier. The training was a strange mixture of boredom and sudden terror. Between drills, the recruits would slip through the wire onto the beach and sunbathe in their tin hats. Overhead, fighters from a nearby airfield climbed away towards the coast. The war still felt like something happening to other people. Then, one afternoon, it stopped feeling that way. Clive was on a cricket pitch of all places, learning how to use a bayonet. He noticed a low aircraft coming straight towards them. He looked again and saw the swastika on its tail. He shouted a warning. The sergeant screamed at the men to break ranks, and they ran for their lives. The bomber dropped its load directly onto the pitch behind them. One recruit was killed, another was wounded. The lesson was simple, and it never left him. Death in this war would not announce itself. It would come out of a clear sky, onto a cricket pitch, in the middle of an ordinary lesson. His training finished, Clive was posted to a famous cavalry regiment. The horses were long gone, replaced by light tanks, and the regiment had a famous figure at its head. Its colonel-in-chief was Winston Churchill himself. Before the regiment sailed for war, Churchill came to see them off, and the men laid on a shooting demonstration with pistols. Most of them had never fired a pistol in their lives. Standing only 15 yards from the targets, one soldier after another missed completely. When it came to Clive's turn, an embarrassed officer quietly stepped him aside and called forward a marksman instead. The expert hit the very edge of the target, and Churchill beamed that at least the man had hit something. Clive was spared the shame of missing in front of the Prime Minister. He could not have known that the regiment he was about to sail with was heading for a disaster. The journey took months. A troopship across the Atlantic, almost to America and back, to fool the U-boats. A stop in South Africa, where he was startled by the signs dividing black from white. Then Egypt, and the dust and the freezing desert nights. Clive did something here that would shape everything that came after. When the list went up of men for the first wave, he was marked down as a reserve, to be held back. He was insulted. So he volunteered to go forward instead, as a stretcher bearer, drawing on his old ambulance training. He was accepted. What nobody mentioned was that he was the only stretcher bearer chosen, and the job rather needs two. It was a small decision. It made him the man who carried the wounded, and it would save his life more than once. In the spring of 1941, the regiment sailed north and landed in Greece. It was a campaign that never had a chance. The British light tanks, armed only with machine guns, were sent against German panzers. They were destroyed. From the air, German dive bombers fell on the columns again and again, day after day, while the men hid in ditches and waited for orders that often did not come. On one retreat, Clive overheard two senior officers in a truck beside him. They did not know where they were. They had lost their map. The whole army was falling back towards the sea, and Clive's regiment was handed the worst job of all, the rear guard. They were ordered to hold the southern shore of a great gulf against a German landing, while everyone else escaped. That night, Clive watched a long line of headlights pouring down the mountain roads opposite. For a moment, he thought it must be the British army, still fighting. It was the German army, advancing. What followed was an escape across half of Greece on foot. When the position collapsed and word came that 2/3 of the men had been captured, Clive and a handful of others took to the hills. They started as 17 men. As they walked, they picked up stragglers until they were 40, then more, with 3 officers and one aim: reach the coast, find a boat, get to Crete. They pooled what little money they had, bought a mule, and hired a local guide, a fearless man they called Peter the Greek. They loaded the mule with their rifles, blankets, and ammunition. It served them well, until a steep path where the animal lost its footing and went over the edge. The men could only watch as it tumbled down the slope, shedding its load as it fell. It should have been killed. Instead, it picked itself up at the bottom, shook off the fall, and wandered into the scrub as if nothing had happened, the one small absurdity in a desperate march. The days were burning hot, the nights bitterly cold, and water was almost impossible to find. And everywhere they went, they depended on people who had almost nothing. Villagers shared their bread and goat's milk with the British soldiers, knowing that helping an enemy of the occupation could cost them their lives. Not everyone was kind. More than once the men woke to find rifles stolen in the night, but the ordinary courage of those mountain families kept the column alive. For 5 days they hid inside an enormous cave, a passage said to run for miles into the mountain, used by ancient armies for the very same purpose. They saw daylight for 1 hour a day. Women from the villages crept out to bring them baskets of food. At last, after 3 weeks, they reached the sea, around 70 strong now, camped in a rocky cove. One of the officers set off alone in a captured dinghy, rowing for Crete, swearing he would send the navy back for them. So they waited. One evening, Clive saw the flashes of a great naval battle far out at sea and felt a flicker of hope that someone was still resisting. But the boat never came. The rescue was always just over the horizon, and it never came. When a patrol approached, the men scattered into the hills. Clive was ordered to stay behind with a sergeant whose knee had swollen so badly he could not walk. He was the medic. It was his duty. He slept among the rocks beside the injured man and woke to machine gun fire and the sight of German soldiers coming up the shore. The sergeant told him to go, to leave him, to save himself. Clive scrambled inland over the rocks. He rounded a corner and stopped dead. In front of him stood a young German soldier, a rifle pointed straight at his chest, a nervous finger on the trigger. Behind him, more men and a machine gun. Clive slowly raised his hands. For him, the war was over. He had been free for the last time for 4 long years. The journey into captivity was almost as deadly as the fighting, a dry dock where men were left to bake by day and freeze by night. Barracks run by the SS, so crowded he had to sleep in a trench. A march of more than 30 miles in the sun, with the sick and the wounded stumbling along. Then the cattle trucks, packed so tight a man could barely breathe, rolling for days and nights across Europe. Bread and a ladle of soup once at a station, then on again. The train finally stopped in the Austrian Alps. The men staggered out into the cold mountain air and were marched to a camp. They were counted and counted again. They were stripped, washed, and given new clothes to replace the rags crawling with lice. The next morning, a German clerk asked each man his trade before the war. Word had gone round that butchers might get more food. So roughly 7 in every 10 of the 2,000 prisoners suddenly claimed to be butchers. Clive told the truth. He said he was an actor. It is a small moment, but hold on to it. Because the actor who would one day play a butcher had, in a freezing Austrian camp, refused to pretend to be one. Over the next years, he was moved from camp to camp, a mountain village where the prisoners widened a cliff road with picks, doing as little as they possibly could for Hitler, waving their arms about and looking busy. A prison built across the top floor of a school, 20 men to a room, the barred windows looking down on the town square. It was the coldest Austrian winter in 40 years. Eyelashes froze. Because he could pick up a little of the language, Clive became the interpreter. Then the men voted him camp leader. It meant carrying every message between the prisoners and the guards, negotiating, escorting the sick, settling every quarrel. He did not enjoy it, but it put him at the center of everything that happened. And one day, something happened that he would never forget. A great Nazi flag had been hung on the prison wall for a passing official. One of the prisoners, in disgust, reached through the bars and set it alight. The other men put it out, but the damage was done. The guards dragged the prisoners into the street, where villagers were screaming for blood, and demanded to know who had done it. No one spoke. A German sergeant major arrived and gave them 5 minutes. If no one confessed, he said, they would begin shooting 1 man in every 3. And it fell to Clive, the interpreter, to translate that threat to his own friends, to stand in front of them and tell them, in plain English, that a third of them were about to be shot. Then a girl from the village pointed out a man. The wrong man. an innocent prisoner named George who was marched off to a cell despite everything he said. And as they were herded back inside, another prisoner quietly broke down and confessed to Clive that he was the one. He could not let an innocent man take it. Clive translated the confession. George was freed. The real culprit was taken away. That night, Clive resigned as camp leader. You might think there was no place for comedy in all this. You would be wrong, because comedy was the one weapon they had left. In every camp, Clive found an audience. Early on, two friends asked him to perform an old routine from his acting days, a silly piece about a family of funny faces trying to blow out a candle. Around 50 men gathered to watch in the freezing hut, and for a few minutes they forgot where they were. It lifted them. It lifted him. And in a place built to strip men of every choice, those few minutes gave something back. A prisoner cannot decide when he eats or when he sleeps. But for the length of a sketch, the man on the floor of the hut decided what the room felt. That was a kind of power, and they all knew it. When he was moved to a larger camp, full of prisoners from a dozen nations, he discovered he was the only professional actor among thousands of men. The camp had a theatre run by a New Zealand padre, and Clive threw himself into it. He played the auctioneer in a production of The Skin Game. For a great Christmas show, a lavish staging with costumes and an orchestra, he was given the female lead, a gypsy princess, and walked out in front of the whole camp in a clinging dress and a wig. The men adored it. One of those camp programs still survives today. It was kept for a lifetime by a fellow prisoner, and it now sits in the collection of the Imperial War Museum, a handmade bill for a show called Roll on Parade, the cast signatures inked across the back, one of them a young man signing himself simply Bob Dunn. The Christmas show was meant to run for a week. It ended when the stove caught fire and burned the theatre to the ground. There were letters too. His mother arranged for his church to send parcels. His grandmother wrote to him. She always called him Buddy. One of her letters had been read and cut by the British censors, and then read and cut again by the German ones, until almost nothing was left. By the time it reached him, the whole letter said just this: Dear Buddy, love, Nana. He laughed about that letter for the rest of his life. The laughter was worth more than the lost news. This is the thing to understand about Clive Dunn. The jokes were not in spite of the suffering. The jokes were how he survived it. But there are some things that no joke can hold back. The theatre had burned down, so the company decided to put on a concert instead to lift the camp's spirits. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing in the sky to mark it out from any other. Clive needed material for the show, so he walked across to another hut where a friend named Johnny McGeorge kept a book of jokes. The two went through it, and Clive copied out a few gags for his act. Then he took his leave and walked the 20 or so yards back to his own hut. He had been back about 3 minutes when the ground shook. American bombers, far off their course, were dropping their loads onto the prisoner of war camp. The men had no warning and nowhere to go. The raid was over almost as quickly as it began. And when the dust began to settle, whole huts had simply ceased to exist, and the bare ground between them was torn open with craters. One of the huts that was gone was the hut Clive had walked out of 3 minutes before. Johnny McGeorge was dead. And here is where you see what Clive Dunn was made of. He did not freeze, and he did not run. He remembered that he was a medic. He went towards the craters, not away from them. In one of them, a German guard lay pinned and crushed beneath a fallen beam, one of the men who had kept him captive for years. Clive climbed down into the smoking pit, hauled the beam clear, and dragged the man out. The guard struggled to his feet and ran off without a word, without so much as a backward glance. A British prisoner, standing in the wreckage of an attack that had just killed his friends, had just saved the life of one of his enemies. 40 prisoners died in that raid. Clive spent the hours and days that followed nursing the wounded in the camp hospital, holding men together, helping the surgeon through his operations. He had crossed a yard of frozen ground to borrow a joke book and come back to a graveyard. He never really spoke of it for years. But you may wonder, watching him clown as Corporal Jones decades later, whether some part of that afternoon was always still with him. Whether the laughter was, in the end, a kind of armor. As the war turned against Germany, the camps began to empty in chaos. At Easter 1945, Clive's guards simply marched the prisoners out onto the roads. They went from village to village, the column growing as it walked. And then, one day, the guard in charge had finally had enough of the whole war. He said a single word, "Goodbye," and walked away, deserting. The astonished prisoners cheered him off down the road. For 4 more weeks they walked, scavenging for food, bartering socks and scarves with farmers, boiling stinging nettles and dandelion leaves. At one village, Clive stole a handcart to carry their few possessions. At another, prisoners found parcels dumped in a rubbish heap, and in an impossible piece of luck, one of them had Clive's own name on it. 400 cigarettes, sent long ago by his church, now turned into currency to trade for bread. They were herded at last into one final camp, where they were quietly meant to be held as hostages for the war's end. Starving again, Clive and others broke through the wire and raided a warehouse and found only sacks of sugar. He lived on raw white sugar for 3 days. And then, one afternoon, after almost a week, American jeeps rolled up to the gate. It was over. After 4 years, Clive Dunn was free. He came home to England by way of Salzburg and Belgium. The war in Europe was finished, but he was still a soldier, and the army found important work for him to do. For weeks, he was given a stick and sent to pick up scraps of paper around the edge of a base in the north of England. He served on as a medical orderly for a time after the war, before he was finally released. He walked straight back into acting, and when he registered with the Actors' Union, he set aside the name Robert Dunn for good. From now on, he would be Clive Dunn. Acting was never a new beginning for Clive Dunn. It was where he had started. He had been on a film set as a schoolboy, turning up in 2 comedies beside the great screen comedian Will Hay while he was still a teenager, after training at one of London's best-known stage schools. The war took 12 years out of the middle of that career. He simply picked it back up where it had stopped. And in the 1950s, he found the thing he did better than almost anyone. Though he was a young man, he was uncannily good at playing old ones. The shuffle, the wheeze, the watery eye, the wandering memory. He could put on age like a coat. Television noticed. He appeared through both series of an early show built around the comedian Tony Hancock and worked alongside a whole generation of British comic talent, perfecting that doddering old man character years before anyone had heard of Walmington-on-Sea. And then, in 1968, came the role that would define him. A new comedy was being made by the BBC about the Home Guard, a platoon of old men and boys in a sleepy seaside town, drilling with broom handles, preparing to face Hitler's army. The part of Lance Corporal Jones, the elderly butcher full of stories of old imperial wars, needed an actor who could play a man in his 70s. Clive Dunn was 48. He was, in fact, far younger than the part, and younger than almost everyone else playing the platoon's old soldiers, and that was the whole point of hiring him. The other actors playing the old men were, many of them, genuinely old. They could not be asked to take a fall or scramble under a van week after week. Jones could, because the man inside the makeup was decades younger than the character. Hidden under grey hair and grease paint, the youngest body among the platoon's veterans did the physical work of the oldest man in it. And so the catchphrases were born. "Don't panic," bellowed, of course, while panicking. "Permission to speak, sir. They don't like it, Upham." It is one of the funniest things in British comedy. A comic old soldier flapping in terror over an invasion that never quite arrives. And it was being shouted by a man who, 20-odd years before, had stood on a real shore waiting for a real landing and looked down the barrel of a real rifle. The fiction gave Jones a chest of invented medals. The man playing him never mentioned the real war at all. Jones became one of the best-loved characters on British television, watched by audiences that reached 18 million at their peak. The fiction was gentle. The man behind it had earned every ribbon Jones only pretended to wear. In 1971, Clive Dunn did something almost no comic actor of his age has ever done. He had a #1 record. The song was called Grandad, a sentimental little tune sung in his old man voice, backed by a children's choir. It went straight to the top of the British charts and reached #1 in the very week of his 51st birthday. The man who had spent 4 years as a prisoner of war was now, improbably, a pop star. The hit was so popular, it later gave him his own children's television series, where he played a kindly old caretaker, right through to the mid-1980s. But there was steel under the warmth. Off-screen, Clive Dunn was a lifelong socialist, and he did not hide it. It put him sharply at odds with Arthur Lowe, who played the pompous Captain Mainwaring and who was a firm conservative. The two men, so perfectly matched as officer and other ranks on screen, argued about politics off it. For years, Clive turned down official honours. He was, by instinct, suspicious of them. Only later in life did he finally accept appointment to the Order of the British Empire, the kind of establishment medal that Jones wore a whole chestful of, and that the real Clive Dunn had spent a lifetime quietly resisting. In time, Clive Dunn and his wife retired to the sunshine of Portugal. He had married Priscilla, the love of his life, and they had 2 daughters, Polly and Jessica. He spent his last decades painting and gardening and remembering. When he came to write the story of his life, he gave the book the only title it could ever have had. He called it Permission to Speak. Clive Dunn died on the 6th of November 2012 in Portugal. He was 92 years old. He was very nearly the last of them, a final living thread back to that platoon of old soldiers who had made a nation laugh. And this is what that nation should remember. They laughed at Jones, the silly old butcher with his bayonet and his medals and his stories of the Sudan. The medals were invented. The stories were invented. The whole gentle, harmless old soldier was invented. But the man inside the costume was not invented at all. He had been 19 and useless at a recruiting office. He had run from a bomber across a cricket pitch. He had carried the wounded through the wreck of Greece, walked 3 weeks through the mountains, and looked down the barrel of a German rifle. He had translated a death sentence to his own friends. He had gone to borrow a joke book and come back to find 40 men dead, and his friend among them, and had still climbed into the crater to save an enemy. Clive Dunn turned all of that into laughter, not because the suffering did not matter, but because for him, the laughter was how a man survives the things that should break him. He spent the war making frightened men smile in the dark. And then he spent the rest of his life doing exactly the same thing for the rest of us. That was the real Corporal Jones, and he had more than earned his permission to speak. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe to Cinema Peak, where we tell the true stories behind the faces you thought you knew.